Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. It's a privilege to address you all. I'll start off by apologising for my accent. I know it might be a bit hard to understand, and it does put me to shame when I hear so many wonderful accents from all over the world that can speak better English than myself, but I'll do my best. Also, I'm here today representing Firearms UK, and we're basically a non-profit volunteer organisation that is dedicated to preserving and promoting firearms ownership within the UK. And we seek to do this by trying to encourage unity and positive action from within the UK shooting community. So that involves shooters being more involved in the political scene, because at the end of the day it's politicians that make the decisions that affect all our rights and privileges. But it's also more like responding to misinformation within the mainstream and social media, and becoming more involved with introducing more people into the shooting sports and just showing them how wonderful and safe they are. So we're here today to hopefully give a direction for the party in terms of adopting a policy on firearms and self-defence. It's quite a controversial issue in the UK, especially self-defence, and we're trying to do it in such a way that would be not quite as controversial, so the party can concentrate on getting elected rather than dealing with all these associated issues. So basically, when it comes to being pro-gun, the general public has very little knowledge of firearms. They don't know much about the subject of gun crime. They don't know the difference between illegal firearms and legal guns. They don't know the causes of crime, etc., things like that. So it's very hard to approach the subject on this, the public on this issue. But hopefully with people talking about it, it's one of the ways we can do so. If you were to have an overtly pro-gun policy, you would be wide open to attack from the mainstream media and rival parties who tend to rely on subjective arguments based on emotion rather than any logical or factual based arguments. And as you can see I put here, emotional and sensationalist arguments win all the time because people do think with their hearts, not their heads, as I think Will was saying earlier. So our suggestion as a policy should be palatable for the consumption of the general public, and it should be open and honest, but it should lack controversy, so again the party can really just get elected. We also believe it should be split into two policies. One would be a firearms policy, another would be a policy relating to self-defence. Although they can be related, we do think it is important to keep them separate because there's a lot of variables involved. So as you can see here, this is our suggestion for a firearms policy, and you might look at it and think, this is quite basic, there's not much to it. And I said it's deliberately designed to be this way. But if you look at it, if you were to write to an MP just now asking them about their view on firearms ownership, you generally get one of three responses. One is they'll be quite open and honest, and they'll say they don't like firearms, they want to ban all guns, so you know not to vote for them. Two, very, very rarely you might get someone that is open to changing the law and having some reformation. But three, what you'll get most often is a non-committal answer that will reiterate their support for the draconian laws we have in place in the UK because we need to keep the public safe. They won't offer any evidence to support the laws we have, but they'll say how good they are. But they'll also say they recognise the right for people to participate in shooting sports under the current laws. The problem is when it comes to changing the current laws, they won't stick up for shooters. They'll just let the law get changed. And then when it happens, they'll say, tough luck, mate. So in here, as you can see here, a few key words we've put is an evidence-based review of UK firearms legislation. And this is very important because you're committing to doing something that, to my knowledge, has never been done before, and that is reviewing firearms legislation and perhaps making some reformations based on evidence. Pretty much every piece of UK firearms legislation has been based on knee-jerk reactions, it's been based on fear, it's been based on misunderstandings. It's very difficult for me to see any evidence to support the system we currently have or the road we've went down. And if you look back in history, UK legislation, the first real act of gun control in the UK was 1920, and we actually believe we've not had an essential right to bear arms in this country, which is probably an idea that's quite alien now. But in 1920, the law changed, and it was because of fear of a Bolshevik uprising in the working classes that led to this change and this infringement on people's rights. So it wasn't about gun crime going up, it wasn't about people misusing firearms, it was the government's fear of the people not being happy and perhaps having a revolution, as it just happened in Russia at the time. So, as you can see, it's about power and control, not necessarily public safety. But also, I mean, we do have a few other things here that people can't really oppose. I mean, we're talking about reducing expense to the taxpayer, improving public safety, with respecting the rights of individuals. So I don't see how anyone could disagree with such a policy, and it's one that we think would let the party concentrate on other issues, whilst also giving hope to shooters that there's maybe a party out there now that might actually represent us fairly. So obviously, some ideas that we would like to see that could be implemented under reform is just reducing a lot of the red tape involved in obtaining firearm certificates. There's currently just a lot of waste on arbitrary restrictions, which just add cost and put people off from taking part in shooting sports, and they could just simply be done away with. And unless you're a shooter, probably this is maybe quite meaningless to some of you, but it's just, again, to reduce costs and reduce red tape. And again, with hunting, it can be very difficult to get into hunting unless you're very wealthy or you have access to land. So it's again just about improving opportunities for people to get involved and take part in shooting sports. Now, our self-defence policy, or a suggestion for a self-defence policy, is very similar. It revolves around making a commitment to have an evidence-based review on the subject. And again, we're reiterating that if it's about public safety and reducing violent crime, then no discussion should be off the table. And if the evidence supports making changes that are quite radical, then it is about public safety and reducing crime, so why not? Currently, any UK citizen can use reasonable force to defend themselves, and our laws potentially could be quite good. But what you might find yourself is in a situation where you can use reasonable force, but you've got nothing to defend yourself with. And I think this recently has hit home to a lot of people, because we've seen some pretty horrific incidents here in London, and people had to resort to using glass bottles and glass tumblers to try and defend themselves, because we're in a position where the state has taken the ability for you to do so yourself from you. Now, reasonable force is essentially the law that governs the police use of force. But if you look at any police officer, they'll have a baton and a CS spray. Now, if a law-abiding citizen were to carry a baton, it would automatically be deemed an offensive weapon, regardless of intent. And if you had a CS spray or a pepper spray, which I don't even think is anywhere near as effective as a CS, that would be treated the same as a Section 5 firearm, an illegal firearm. So there's a real imbalance there, and this is something that hopefully the party could address at some point. And again, it's about giving hope to people that there'll be evidence-based reviews. You're not being specific about what you'll do, but I'm quite confident that if you look at the evidence, it would suggest that perhaps we should adopt a different path than the one that successive UK governments have chosen, but yet not backed up with evidence. So I'm just going to do some facts versus fiction here. And basically, there's a lot of myths about firearms ownership, and it's incredibly difficult to have any kind of balance to this argument, because the mainstream media is incredibly hostile. If you go on social media, you'll hear people that say they know about firearms, and then they tell you complete nonsense. I've even heard some firearms owners tell you things that just seem made up, they're just not true. But relaxing gun laws will mean more gun crime. After the UK handgun ban, handgun crime and homicide doubled, and it's never dropped to levels below from when handguns were legally available. Now, this is one that at the time everyone said banning handguns will make Britain safer. It simply didn't happen, and after I think even recently in London, with statistics unveiled that firearms crime had went up. So the law only affects law-abiding people, not criminals, who are and always will be the major problem when it comes to gun crime. UK gun control has never caused a reversal in gun crime or homicide. Again, everything has went up. Every time there's a gun ban, it's never reversed any trends. It's just continued to grow. And of course, UK gun owners are amongst the most law-abiding citizens in the country, and that does apply to pretty much every country where they have firearms regulation. You tend to find that gun owners are amongst the top 99% of law-abiding people, simply because they have to be. And again, gun crime is not down to the availability of firearms, but has its roots in socioeconomics. And I've had debates with people that are anti-gun, and they're on this, they just use it as a platform to have a little campaign. Perhaps we do the same, who knows, but they have these little campaigns and don't really seem to care about reducing crime or preventing violence. They just want to ban guns. But I've even had them agree with me, violence has its roots in socioeconomics, but for some reason they don't want to try and tackle those issues, perhaps because they're not easily tackled. So again, more guns means more criminals get them. In fact, criminals do not source their firearms legally, and have been shown to be quite capable of getting them illegally. So again, your issue is gun theft is very rare in the UK from legal owners. Criminals aren't going to go through a process where they're vetted. I think in the UK, a firearms owner is actually vetted by special branch, so it shows you quite how far it goes. They're not going to go through a process that will flag them up to the authorities to then commit some kind of act. And again, as I said, firearms theft is extremely rare. A common one is, if you're having this kind of discussion with anyone, is they'll talk about the United States and they'll say how, oh, if we have guns, we'll end up like America. They've got a Second Amendment and then it's chaos over there. But the United States has seen gun ownership increase in recent years, and yet violent crime rate has plummeted. And there's some places in the United States which isn't very libertarian, but it's mandatory to own a firearm. And there's a place like Kennesaw, Georgia, made this law, and what happened there was the violent crime rate stayed very low. I don't think it had a homicide in 25 years, despite the population increasing. It's had no issues, and indeed many other states, they've relaxed laws, and people will warn, crime will go up. There'll be people having shootouts over petty incidents, but what tends to happen is violent crime drops, and gun owners just get on with their lives because they're not criminals. Again, I've sort of covered this. Banning guns will make us all safer. After the handgun ban, in addition to handgun homicide, rising overall homicide rates also nearly doubled. So this suggests that perhaps if criminals or people intent to commit murder can't access firearms legally or illegally, they'll find some other way to commit their crime. And again, the problem is people aren't interested in tackling crime. They just seem obsessed with banning firearms, and as long as it's not done with firearms, they seem quite happy with that to happen, which I personally think is wrong. In nations such as the Czech Republic, which allows concealed carry of firearms, and you can also have pepper sprays, batons, tasers, have a lower violent crime rate than the UK, and I believe their youth homicide rate is quite a lot lower than where I'm from, Scotland. So, and Scotland's quite a nanny state within itself, so it seems nations can go in different directions and they don't have the problems that we sometimes have. Yep, so as I was saying, gun ownership has risen in the US by 200%, and violent crime has dropped by 14%, and in Kennesaw, Georgia, as I mentioned there, made it mandatory to own firearms. So this is one of my favourites, because people often say if you allowed people to own firearms or tasers, pepper sprays for self-defence, that they would be taken off them and used against them. But studies have shown that when you have people that are potential victims that are able to defend themselves, criminals all of a sudden have a very real deterrent, that person that was an easy target last year now has a way to defend themselves thanks to a change in law. So they're deterred because there's a very real chance that some harm could come to them. And in cases where criminals still attack people, the victim is more likely to be less injured if they have some way of defending themselves than if they had nothing. And it's also quite important to note, in America, the vast majority of incidents involving firearms used for personal protection don't actually involve the firearm even being used. It simply it serves as a deterrent, and it de-escalates the situation, resulting in less violence. And that, to people, that sounds kind of contradictory, but at the end of the day, if we're having less people being injured and less violence, it can only be a good thing. So some good examples, because again, everyone talks about the United States and how terrible it is, but we never seem to talk about other nations with other laws that are perhaps more relaxed, that don't have problems with gun crime. So it's always good if you're having a discussion to perhaps use these examples as well, just to broaden people's horizons. In New Zealand, it's a nation where you can have fully automatic rifles, semi-auto rifles, pistols, shotguns, some of the things we can have here, but a lot more that we can't have. They also have a 10-year certificate life as opposed to a 5-year certificate life, I believe. And I think they're also looking at changing their law on pepper spray to allow that to be carried for personal protection. I don't believe you can own firearms for personal protection in New Zealand, but the point is they have access to firearms that we can't have, but they don't have any issues with them. And I believe their system concentrates more on vetting the individual rather than creating all sorts of arbitrary restrictions and costs that just serve to deter normal people from carrying out good sports. The Czech Republic, as I've mentioned earlier, this is a very good one because it's a modern European nation. It's very close to home. They have a system where you have access to less lethal options for personal protection, and you can go through a course where you have to sit a theory test, a practical test, and a safety test, and you can carry a concealed handgun. And again, they don't have any issues that people say will happen. And I think it's very interesting that the Czech Republic is a nation that's suffered under fascism and then communism and socialism for many years. And I suspect a lot of Central and Eastern European countries have a more libertarian attitude because they remember what it was like to be in countries where personal freedom and individual liberty wasn't respected. It was crushed under authoritarian regimes. And I do suspect that's why a lot of these nations are more relaxed and value the individual's responsibility. Switzerland is a nation where, due to its national defence policy, every home essentially has what would be classed as a military-style assault rifle. It's not a term I'm fond of, but that's what the mainstream media would call it. They might even have several or several generations worth. And again, it doesn't have any problems with gun crime. Now, people say, the media loves to take these pictures of these black rifles and say, oh, if America has a gun problem, look at these kind of guns, they should never be legally available. They facilitate spree killings, they make people go insane. Well, you just need to look at Switzerland. They don't have any issues with them whatsoever. Again, because it's a wealthy country and it doesn't have the socio-economic problems that are the root causes of gun violence or crime in general. And although I said the United States is the example used as a bad example, it's actually a very good one because people can make a very basic comparison to the United States, to the UK, but they don't take in all the variables. They're very lazy, they just don't research it properly. But if you actually look at the United States very closely, you'll see some cities and states have very liberal firearms laws and they've got no issues with gun crime. They've got lower violent crime rates than the national average. And generally everyone gets along. They aren't shooting each other for letting their dog have an accident in their neighbour's garden. It's all very civil. But you can look at other sections of the United States that have very serious socio-economic problems. They've got gang warfare, drug-related warfare, inner city poverty, and these are the places that tend to have this higher than average gun crime and homicide rate, and that skew the figures for the United States and bring it up to make it look like it's got a very real problem when it's actually concentrated in 3 or 4 areas. It's actually estimated that the vast majority of gun homicide in the US is gang related. So I think I've seen figures about 65 and 85% are estimated to be gang-related homicides. And it wouldn't surprise me that if you took those figures to the UK, you'd probably get a very similar outcome, because in the UK, the vast majority of gun crime isn't legal gun owners. It's probably most likely gang and drug-related, serious crime, not just ordinary people. Now, this is just a little graph I've made up, but it's designed just to re-emphasise the point that there's no correlation between gun ownership and increased gun homicides. Now, if you look at some of these figures, it's actually very hard to see there, because in Europe it is fairly low in general, but the red line represents gun homicide. Now, you can see there, within the selected countries, it pretty much stays at 0. It's very low. It's around about between 0.5 and 1, so it's not a lot. But you'll see the gun ownership levels here. Some of them are going up in some nations, but yet the gun homicide rate is very low, and even the overall homicide rate is very low. There's simply no correlation with it, and this is the point Firearms UK always tries to make. We won't ever say that gun ownership reduces crime. There's a lot of studies out there that show it can have a beneficial effect in reducing crime, but our argument is it doesn't have any impact on crime. Potentially it could reduce it, but it doesn't cause crime to increase. But yet we're constantly subject to arbitrary restrictions that seem only to allow politicians to be seen to be doing something without actually tackling the real problems of crime and violence in society. And even if you don't like guns, I think this is something that the nation should address and hold politicians accountable for, because they shouldn't just be making examples of people that aren't the problem. They should be tackling the problems, and any citizen should be outraged at the path through the gone down in this country. These two graphs, or tables rather, are just to serve as, again, another interesting talking point. Now, we all hear about the United States and how they do seem to have a problem with spree killings. And these figures are based on the FBI definition of a mass shooting. And if you look at the left, that should be the United States figures. Now, between the dates, I think it's January 2009 and December 2015, the United States had 200, or just under 200 fatalities from mass shootings and 197 non-fatal injuries, which is terrible. I think we could all agree. And of course, gun control advocates use this to further their argument of why we need strict gun control and why gun control makes us safer. But if you just look to the graph on the right now, or the table rather, again, you can see the US figures at the bottom, and then you can look at the figures for the European Union within the same period, and they're actually higher. Now, I do accept the European Union has a higher population than the United States, but once you extrapolate it all out, the figures, the rate isn't so different. So the question is, again, why do gun control advocates not care about public safety? We have strict gun control within the UK, within Europe, and you can see several incidents where occasionally it's been a legal firearms owner that's perhaps slipped through the process, but there's been terrorist attacks that have killed hundreds within Europe with illegal firearms. They're not tackling the root causes, and ultimately you can't really deter bad people from doing bad things, because again in Europe we've seen incidents where terrorists have used heavy goods vehicles to kill hundreds of people and injure hundreds more, whereas in the United States you had the Las Vegas attack featuring the much feared bump stocks and at a lower death rate than the Nice attack, which featured a heavy goods vehicle. So again, it isn't a gun problem, it's a people problem, and the authorities really need to get their act together and start tackling the root causes of crime and violence, because it's no longer acceptable for gun owners to be held as scapegoats. And indeed, if there is evidence out there to suggest that relaxing laws could improve public safety, I do think it's about time we had that discussion. So I'll open the floor up to any questions.